I don't know if you recall, but at the end of my presentation last year, I introduced a project that we were just about to start. And it so happens that we've literally just finished. So it's a really good opportunity today to be able to present some of our findings to you. I want to acknowledge my colleagues Christina Hicks, Pedro Fiedelman and Renee Tobin, who have helped in this project, and NCARF, who have funded the bulk of it. Now, as a 10-month mad dash of a project, it's very much a scoping study, but I do think we have some important and interesting findings. So the aims of the project were to explore ecological and social limits to climate change adaptation in the Great Barrier Reef fishing and tourism industries, and to investigate trade-offs and synergies between industries, so recreational and commercial fishing, or fishing and tourism, and between outcomes, so for example profitability and sustainability. Adaptation, as you know, is a response to real or perceived disturbance, so in this case climate change, which aims to reduce negative impacts and realise benefits. Adaptation can occur in social and natural systems at different scales, so fishers and the fishing industry can adapt. Limits to adaptation are the conditions that make adaptation ineffective as a response to climate change. Another way of looking at it is to consider adaptation limited where a particular strategy fails to reduce the vulnerability of the entity adapting, whether it is your fisher or your fishing industry. Now, limits are important because they represent the points at which, or thresholds at which, for example, corals may no longer acclimatise to rising sea temperatures, where technologies may fail to buffer the impacts from sea level rise, or where the costs of adaptation begin to exceed the costs of your averted impacts. Today I'm talking about human adaptation and social limits, and in this regard the work to date has been relatively academic or conceptual, or has focused on technical and economic limits. So as far as I know, this is one of the first to empirically scope social limits to climate change adaptation. Now, limits to adaptation are expected to become more evident as climate change progresses. So we developed a set of 4 alternative future scenarios for 2050 as a tool for this research. We did this through a rapid literature review and a process of scientific consultation. Very briefly, this shows you the framework. There are 4 alternative storylines, 1A to 2B, along 2 different axes. So a best case and a worst case climate situation for 2050, compared with, or combined with contrasted limited and ideal adaptation. We then took these scenarios to multi-stakeholder workshops and followed up with some interviews with people who couldn't come to the workshops. And in these fora we explored the plausibility of the scenarios for different parts of the GBR, to what extent different adaptation strategies were likely to be effective or not under different climate change situations, and also what the implications were for the industries of different pathways. We recorded the data, transcribed it and coded it in vivo, and we've recently presented some of our results to organisation representatives to essentially sense check some of our analysis. So on this slide, you can see a range of different adaptation strategies which emerged from the literature review and the scientific consultation process as possibilities for individuals and industries within the GBR. Now, to essentially evaluate to what extent these were effective or limited, we asked stakeholders to identify what were desirable outcomes from adaptation or valued outcomes. Commercial fishing and the tourism industry essentially identified sustainability and profitability as important, whereas the recreational fishery identified sustainability and enjoyment as important. Enjoyment is, however, also a component of lifestyle values within the commercial fishing and tourism industries. So in this study, adaptation is limited where it reduces or fails to increase, where necessary, sustainability, profitability, and or enjoyment. So this is essentially the analytical framework that we used. Now, I want to start with two examples that emerged from our research to give you an idea of how adaptation can be limited. The first example is with regards to effort management in the East Coast trawl fishery. This is a schematic of the fisher families or operators that work in the sector. An increasing number of fishers work at a loss as prices stagnate, costs increase, and profit lines shift right. The majority of fishers are described as lifestyle fishers, but those that manage to continue to profit in the fishery were described more as entrepreneurs or innovators. Now, the problem for the industry is that the fishery as a whole is non-viable or non-profitable. It is also highly distributed, so no single operator owns any more than 3% of what they call effort units or quota. So the fishery is already in a fairly challenging state economically. Now, if we superimpose climate change on that, which is projected to result in increased variability in abundance and distribution of fishery resources, the profit line becomes even more uncertain. Now, the primary adaptation response under consideration for this fishery is the permanent removal of effort from the fishery through buybacks or facilitated exit of operators. But there are several problems with this strategy. So first, it's about who's going to pay. An industry buyback is not considered feasible in this case because of the high distribution of quota. So even profitable businesses cannot afford to buy out their counterparts. A government buyback is also questionable because in the past these have occurred under a sustainability clause in the GBR, and to date the East Coast trawl fishery, or at the moment, is not considered to be a threat to sustainability. You then have to ask whether fishers actually want to exit the fishery. There has not been particularly good experience of buyback schemes within the GBR, and many of you know the stories associated with the 2004 rezoning. You would also generally like to promote the exit of fisheries at the lower end of the profit line, so the more of the lifestyle fishers, and in general they're the least willing to exit the fishery and the least able to adapt to alternative employment opportunities. Third, you have to ask whether removing effort from the fishery actually increases availability of resources for those that remain. And respondents in our research suggested that in fact, because of the nature of their fishery, which is highly variable and time rather than resource dependent, removing effort from the industry like this would not necessarily increase catch-all profits for those that remain. And this list of factors essentially means that this strategy is not necessarily going to improve outcomes for fishery operators or decrease their vulnerability to risk, including climate change. Now, in the coral reef finfish fishery, the story is different because sustainability is a problem in this fishery and profits are driven by resource abundance and allocation. In this case, a buyback scheme would actually be fairly effective. However, other adaptation strategies are limited, so I want to use this example to talk through mobility and temporary effort management. The coral reef finfish fishery largely targets the coral trout, and a large proportion of profits are driven by live fish trade to China and elsewhere. And Mike gave us a brilliant demonstration of how valuable that fishery is. Now, climatic events such as cyclones have been shown to reduce catch yields in this fishery through potential changes to abundance or distribution of the resource. And climate change trends are projected to essentially prolong reductions and shifts in distribution of these fish species. In 2009, Cyclone Hamish hit the GBR, tracking along the reef. The primary response of fishers was to move further north along the reef to areas less impacted by the cyclone event. However, the specialised market for the fishery for live fish to China essentially meant that fishers didn't move very far north and they congregated around Bowen. Now, fish are redder in the southern GBR, and so they receive a higher market price in Bowen compared to markets further north. So they congregated around Bowen and essentially didn't reduce the vulnerability through mobility of those that did move, and potentially increase the vulnerability of those who are already fishing in that area. This is a news article from the Townsville Bulletin 2 days ago, which demonstrates the conflict between commercial fishers around this issue. This is about fishers now moving further north from Bowen to Innisfail, and fishers in Innisfail essentially sabotaging their gears and so on. So that doesn't demonstrate, a reduction in vulnerability and a very effective adaptation strategy in this case. Another option is the voluntary shelving of 23% of the quota in the fishery for 12 months following Cyclone Yasi. So this is essentially an operator-driven suggestion, but it's limited by the fact that the fishery is also accessed and extracted by recreational fishers who aren't necessarily party to these commercial fishing regulations. So again, this adaptation strategy is limited in its ability to reduce vulnerability of the commercial fishing sector. So that demonstrates a couple of ways in which adaptation can be limited. Now, our research found that distinct adaptation strategies were often influenced by a set of interacting factors. It's very difficult to isolate independent limits. So instead what we've done is classify them into different bundles of limits, essentially, which influence different GBR sectors in subtly different ways. Now, I don't have time to go through all, but I would like to highlight the first three. Australia in a globalised world. This set of limits is about Australia's position as a globally integrated market economy. There's very high competition within domestic markets from international goods, and high competition in international or export markets that Australian fisheries participate in. This essentially drives down the price of seafood and reduces the market share of fisheries, so reducing profitability for operators. And this can essentially limit the potential for adaptation through business planning, through effort management, and through diversification for these sectors. The example that I gave you of the East Coast trawl fishery, this is one of the most limiting factors, and in fact is the primary factor that means that effort reduction, permanent effort reduction, would not necessarily reduce resilience in that fishery. But the story is similar in the tourism industry. High competition, market competition is driven by more lax regulatory frameworks and also lower base costs in terms of energy and labour in competing tourism destinations, which means again that profitability is driven down and the sector is less able to use strategies such as diversification and business planning effectively. Another set of limits relates to this issue of collective action. Our research suggests that adaptation on the individual operator level is not adequate to essentially increase profits, sustainability and enjoyment for the industry and operators as a whole, and instead that a whole of industry or an integrated industry approach is needed. The example of the Coral Reef finfish fishery demonstrates this quite well. Mobility is essentially limited in this fishery because fishers cannot coordinate within the industry itself to climatic events such as cyclones, which led to high conflict in some cases. And it also limits the potential for temporary effort management. So, for instance, the absence of coordination between the commercial fishing sector and the recreational fishing sector in that case means that temporary effort management would not work as it would if you would perhaps have some coordination. But this is exacerbated by the fact that the recreational fishing sector see themselves as natural environmental stewards and perceive themselves to have a very low impact on the GBR as individuals, as demonstrated by this quote. What this means is that the recreational fishing sector are less willing to engage in discussions around integrated management and adaptation of the Great Barrier Reef. Which leads us to a third set of limits around these perceptions and reputations. Now, perceptions can affect how different stakeholders perceive the validity of different adaptation strategies and the desirability of different outcomes. So again, with the recreational fishing sector, because they already see themselves as having low impact, they don't use stewardship as a strategy, which means demonstrated ability to sustain your environment, to their advantage as a tactical adaptation option. But how other people, so consumers in particular, view GBR industries and stakeholders is also an important limiting factor, both within commercial fishing and the tourism industry. The commercial fishing industry is still widely viewed by consumers as highly and irresponsibly exploitative, despite many changes within the industry with regards to stewardship. This reduces market share and profitability of the sector and essentially limits the potential for adaptation through, again, business planning, effort management and diversification. Similarly, within the tourism industry, a lot of participants argue that management and research within the GBR has essentially perpetuated a very pessimistic and negative view of the GBR and its long-term prospects, particularly in relation to climate change. And this is pervading consumer perceptions of the reef, reducing market share for the tourism industry in Australia and essentially limiting again the potential for adaptation through business planning and diversification. In fact, this issue of reputation or improving reputation is seen as one of the critical opportunities for adaptation in the GBR ongoing. So to finish up, I want to give you a few key messages. When it comes to social limits, essentially the points at which these factors render adaptation ineffective as a response to climate change are essentially subjective or socially constructed. So they're not absolute or insurmountable, which is how limits have been seen in the literature to date. And in fact, often stakeholders will describe limits as opportunities as much as they will limits. Distinct adaptation strategies are effectively influenced by sets of interacting limits. We have tried to characterise these, and we argue that these make potential broad entry points for policy and research to try and overcome limits to adaptation. And finally, limits to adaptation do have relevance practically, so they do influence adaptation outcomes. And therefore efforts to essentially design ways of evaluating adaptation options ex ante or before implementation could benefit from including a limits perspective. Thank you to all of you who participated in different parts of this work, and thank you for listening.